Thank you, Matt, very much for that generous introduction. I only blushed at the thought of being stripped naked and covered with Vaseline and plastered for the Ben Franklin statue. And I also want to just take this opportunity to say that I am so delighted with the way the House History Office has turned out in its resurrected and newly incarnated version, and it gives me great hope for the future of federal history. And you've done a splendid job, you and your staff, and I'm just honored to see how that's turned out. I'm also very honored to be here before you to give the Trask lecture today. Roger's career demonstrates perfectly the title of my talk, The Value of Federal History. Wherever Roger worked in the federal government, at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, at the Department of Defense, or the General Accounting Office, he produced solid histories that are models of what federal historians can do. One of Benjamin Franklin's little stories that so charmed the ladies of the French court told of the ephemera fly that lived its whole life in a single day. The wise old fly, who was 7 hours old, sat on a leaf by himself while younger flies sat nearby. The old fly said he could remember when the great orb in the sky first rose in the east, and now it was beginning to disappear into the west. My, all the things he had to tell those young flies. I feel like that old fly. I became a historian before the great orb of public history appeared in the east. I was such a young fly then that I did not know that my chosen profession contained people who had rewarding careers in the federal government. Some became park rangers at historic sites across the nation, from as diverse places as the Independence Hall in Philadelphia, to a Civil War battle site, or to the Grand Canyon, where they introduced millions of Americans to these wonderful treasures. Others found places to ply their craft inside the U.S. military and in the many civilian agencies of the federal government. Still others found rewarding careers in state and local government and even in private industry. I certainly didn't learn about these careers from any of my professors. They were all busy as bees trying to make my generation of historians into their image so that we could take their place in the classroom. While professional historians have worked in the federal government for more than a century, a broader awareness of the work of federal historians took flight during World War II in military history and in the early 1970s in many other agencies. Robert Kelly, the historian at the University of California in Santa Barbara, was the first, or certainly close to the first, to use the term public history to differentiate a whole category of historians who plied their craft outside of academia. Kelly saw public history historians as a vital part of governing and the decision-making process of government by providing policymakers, legislators, military leaders, business leaders, and the public with an understanding of issues set in their historical context. He was a great spokesman for the value of applying history to all aspects of human affairs, and especially to government, which makes policy and has the responsibility to be accountable to the public. By 1978, the public history movement, as it was called, had its own journal, The Public Historian, and the following year, the Society for History in the Federal Government began. In that first issue of The Public Historian, Richard G. Hewlett, one of the great pioneers of public history and a founder of this organization, wrote an article called The Practice of History in the Federal Government. He wrote his article at a time of crisis in the employment of historians, a job shortage, declining enrollments in history courses, and the decline of liberal arts in secondary education. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? That job crisis never went away. Hewlett traces the early origins of historians who worked in the federal government and found a few notable pioneers before World War II especially the highly influential J. Franklin Jameson, in any talk of the value of federal history, it would be impossible not to give a nod to Jameson. He was the first PhD in history from Johns Hopkins, who was at the founding meeting of the American Historical Association in 1884, and he edited the American Historical Review from 1895 to 1928. During most of these same years, he was director of the Department of Historical Research at the Carnegie Institution in Washington. He took the lead in creating the National Historical Publications Commission in 1934, and at age 69, he became chief of the manuscript division of the Library of Congress. He helped create the American Council of Learned Societies, and he is largely responsible for pushing the passage of the bill that created the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. In his spare time, he secured $500,000 to launch the multi-volume Dictionary of American Biography. Jameson died in 1937, a few months after being struck by a car crossing First Street between the Capitol and the Library of Congress. I always use extra caution when I cross that street, not wanting history to repeat itself. In Hewlett's article, he described the expansion of the federal history during World War II. It seems as though it takes a crisis, a severe crisis, before the role of historians in government can be recognized. Plans were underway after the First World War to create a massive, comprehensive study of that war, but those plans were scuttled. No one expected another war on that scale anytime soon. At the beginning of World War II, the U.S. military could have used a good multi-volume study of its operations in World War I. The second time around, the military did a much better job, and more than a dozen studies of military operations were prepared by military historians and civilian historians. The Center for Military History published more than 80 volumes on World War II, most of it completed within 15 years of the end of that war. In addition to military historians, Hewlett identified several other types of federal historians who emerged during and after World War II. There were those like Jameson, who were historian/archivists, and others who were documentary editors, like Clarence E. Carter, editor of the multi-volume Territorial Papers of the United States, and Tyler Dennett, who was the first professional historian to edit the State Department's Foreign Relations series. After Jameson's generation, federal historians continued to be active in academic and professional associations, but they found less in common with their academic colleagues as time went on. Sometimes federal historians applied their craft in present-time political situations that did not fit with the academic model of scientific detachment and academic independence. Scholars in the academy picked their own topics for research rather than working for government administrators who often determined what historians worked on. Federal historians worked collaboratively with others in their agencies and in their branches of government, while academic historians prided themselves on being lone independents. As academic history grew more specialized in the 20th century, departments of history continued to train historians to become academic historians. Alternative careers in government service were seldom, if ever, considered. I recall Congressman Bill Frenzel of Minnesota used to stand up on the floor of the House and complain that the House of Representatives had a historian. He said the Speaker's office needed a historian about as much as it needed a plumber or a golf pro. He wondered why the House needed a historian when there were all these academic historians out there who could study House history. He said the only reason the Speaker wanted a historian was because the Senate had one. I always wished at such times as those that I was a member of Congress. I would rise from my seat and ask the distinguished gentleman from the great state of Minnesota to yield for a question and Frenzel would yield. And I would say, would the distinguished gentleman like to name one single academic historian who is systematically researching the United States House of Representatives? If only he had known that academic historians had abandoned the study of the House and the Senate years before, just like they abandoned political history in general. History is not a perfect discipline. Neither is economics, nor political science, or even the practice of law. But government service is filled with far more lawyers, economists, and those with political science degrees than those trained in history. The federal government, in all three branches, needs all of these professions to help it function properly. The thing that historians bring to the table is context, or as Robert Kelly put it, the dimension of time. We can also bring, when we do our jobs well, a higher level of clarity when it comes to writing and editing. We can tell stories, not just write reports.